In the autumn of the year 1567, beneath skies heavy with the promise of conquest, an empire on the rise set its gaze upon a kingdom that refused to kneel. The Mughal Empire, vast and insatiable, stretched from the Afghan highlands to the fertile plains of Hindustan, yet one jewel remained beyond its grasp. One defiant realm still held the old banner high, its fortresses unconquered, its warriors unbowed. Muir. The last great Rajput kingdom that dared to say no. And at the heart of Muir, perched atop a near-vertical plateau that clawed 180 meters into the sky, stood a fortress whose very name commanded reverence and dread alike. Chittorgarh. Chitta. The Hill of Kings. 320 hectares of stone ramparts, temples, and palaces crowning a mesa that nature herself seemed to have carved for war. For 8 centuries, Chittor had been the beating heart of Rajput pride. Twice before, it had fallen, once to Alauddin Khilji in 1303, again to Bahadur Shah of Gujarat in 1535, and both times, the world had witnessed the terrible ritual of Jauhar, the mass self-immolation of women and children to escape dishonor, while their men rode out to embrace death in the final charge, the Saka. 30,000 souls consumed by flame in 1303. 13,000 in 1535. The plateau had drunk rivers of blood and been scorched by funeral pyres so vast they turned day into dusk. Yet Chittor always rose again. Now, in this year of 1567, the fortress stood once more as the symbol of resistance against the mightiest power the subcontinent had ever known. Emperor Akbar, grandson of Babur who had shattered the Delhi Sultanate at Panipat, son of Humayun who had nearly lost it all, was only 25 years old but already a legend. He had crushed rebellion after rebellion, absorbed kingdom after kingdom into his realm. His artillery was the finest in Asia. His cavalry swept across plains like monsoon floods. His treasury overflowed with the tribute of a dozen conquered lands. But Muir would not bend. Rana Uday Singh too, the aging ruler of Muir, had politely declined Akbar's offers of alliance. He would not attend the Mughal court. He would not offer his daughter in marriage to seal a treaty. He would not acknowledge Mughal suzerainty. To Akbar, this was intolerable. Every other major Rajput clan, Amber, Marwar, Bikaner, had entered into matrimonial alliances with the Mughals, their kings becoming mansabdars, military commanders within the imperial hierarchy. But Muir, proud and ancient Muir, held itself apart. And so Akbar resolved to break them. In September of 1567, the emperor departed from Agra with an army that chroniclers would describe in tones of awe and terror. 50,000 soldiers at minimum. Some accounts whisper of far greater numbers, perhaps twice that, swelling with levies and camp followers until the host seemed numberless as locusts. War elephants draped in chain mail and steel plate, bearing swivel guns and archers and howdahs. Thousands upon thousands of cavalry, Mughal, Rajput, Afghan, and Turanian warriors loyal to the Padishah. Infantry armed with matchlocks, swords, pikes, and the new weapons of the age, muskets that could punch through armor at 200 paces. But it was the artillery that truly spoke of Akbar's intent to humble the mountain. Great siege guns, cast in bronze and iron, each requiring teams of oxen to haul across the dusty plains of Rajasthan. Mortars that could lob explosive shells over the highest walls. Smaller field pieces, swivel guns, and the Mughal engineers' most prized possession, mining equipment. Picks, shovels, timber for tunnel supports, barrels of gunpowder. The Mughals had perfected the art of undermining fortress walls, digging beneath foundations, placing charges, and collapsing entire sections of rampart in thunderous eruptions of stone and flame. This was not a raid. This was not a punitive expedition. This was annihilation made manifest. Word of the advancing host reached Chittor long before the dust of their march darkened the horizon. Rana Uday Singh convened his council of nobles and captains. The debate was bitter. Some argued they should abandon Chittor, retreat to the Aravalli hills, wage guerrilla war from the mountains and jungles where Mughal cavalry could not reach them. Better to preserve the bloodline, the army, the kingdom itself, than to stake everything on one fortress, no matter how formidable. Others roared that to abandon Chittor was to abandon Muir's soul. The fortress was not merely stone and mortar, It was the spiritual capital of the Rajputs, the site where their ancestors had bled and died for honor. To flee without a fight would be to spit on every warrior who had ever held these walls. In the end, Rana Uday Singh made a decision that history would judge with complexity and nuance. He himself would depart, taking with him the royal family, the treasury, and a portion of the army to establish a new capital deeper in the Aravalli range. Chittor would be defended to the last breath, but the dynasty would survive to fight another day. To command the defense, he appointed two of the fiercest warriors Muir had ever produced. Jaimal Rathore of Merta, a chieftain of legendary prowess, crippled in one leg from an old battle wound but still the terror of every battlefield he graced. His very name was a war cry. Soldiers who served under him spoke of a man who seemed to welcome death yet never found it, who rode into the thickest press of enemies with a smile on his lips and carnage in his wake. And Pada Sisodia of Kelwa, young and burning with the fierce pride of the Sisodia clan, the royal family of Muir itself. Pada was barely in his 20s, but he carried the bloodline of Rana Sanga, the great king who had nearly destroyed Babur at Kanwa. He wore his ancestry like armor. Together, these two men would hold Chittor. With them remained 8,000 Rajput warriors. Some sources claim as many as 12,000, though the exact number is lost to the fog of war and the embellishments of chroniclers. 8,000 swords sworn to defend the plateau until the sky itself fell upon them. They were supported by 40,000 peasants, townsfolk, servants, and families who had taken refuge within the fortress walls, hoping the ramparts would shield them from the storm that was coming. Provisions were stockpiled. Grain silos filled to bursting. Water cisterns, fed by ancient reservoirs carved into the plateau itself, would sustain them through months of siege. Ammunition was distributed to every bastion and tower. Archers checked their bowstrings. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging spearheads and arrowheads. And the fortress itself, the fortress was a marvel of medieval military engineering. Chittor was not one wall, but a labyrinth of concentric defenses ascending the plateau in a deadly spiral. At the base, where the cliffs were lowest, massive outer walls rose 30 feet high, punctuated by bastions that jutted out like ship prows, allowing defenders to pour flanking fire onto any attacker foolish enough to approach. These walls were not mere stone, they were cyclopean constructions of hewn rock fitted together with such precision that mortar was almost unnecessary, designed to resist both battering rams and artillery. Above the outer circuit lay the middle walls, broader, higher, protecting the administrative quarters and lesser palaces. And above those, crowning the summit plateau, stood the inner citadel, where the royal palaces, temples, and the Tower of Victory, the Vijay Stam, soared 9 stories into the heavens, a monument to an earlier triumph over the sultans of Malwa. 7 fortified gates guarded the ascending road that serpentined up the hillside, each gate a death trap in its own right. An attacking force would have to breach them one by one, climbing upward under withering fire from ramparts above, channeled into killing zones where cavalry was useless and infantry could be slaughtered by the hundreds. And beneath it all, woven through the bedrock of the plateau like veins through flesh, ran a network of secret tunnels. Some led to hidden sally ports, allowing defenders to launch surprise raids against besiegers. Others connected the various levels of the fortress, enabling rapid reinforcement of threatened sections. And one, the most carefully guarded secret of all, was a supply tunnel that stretched beyond the walls, emerging in a ravine 2 miles distant where Allied-built tribesmen could smuggle in food, water, and intelligence even while the fortress was surrounded. This was the fortress Akbar had come to break. On the 23rd day of October, 1567, the Mughal army arrived at the foot of the plateau and began to deploy. It took 3 days simply to establish the siege lines. The host was so vast that its encampment encircled Chittor in a ring of leather tents, cooking fires, and picket lines that stretched for miles. Cavalry patrols ranged across the surrounding countryside, cutting off any hope of relief or resupply, or so they believed. Mughal engineers surveyed the walls with practiced eyes, identifying weak points, calculating angles for artillery bombardment, planning the placement of siege trenches and mining operations. Akbar himself established his command tent on a low ridge to the northeast, from which he could observe the entire fortress. Each morning, he would emerge and stare up at the ramparts, as if through sheer force of will he could compel the stones to crumble. The defenders, meanwhile, watched from the heights. They could see the Mogul banners snapping in the wind, the glint of sunlight on thousands of helmets and lance tips, the great bronze guns being dragged into position. They knew what was coming. There would be no mercy. No quarter. This was a siege of annihilation. On the fourth day, the bombardment began. The Mogul artillery opened fire at dawn, and the mountains shook with thunder. Cannonballs weighing 50 pounds, 80 pounds, 100 pounds, hurled through the air with a sound like ripping cloth, slamming into the outer walls in eruptions of stone dust and flying shrapnel. The gunners were methodical, patient. They aimed for the same section of wall again and again, hour after hour, day after day, seeking to create a breach. But Chittor's walls were ancient and deep. The cannonballs chipped away at the surface, gouged craters, sent fragments spinning through the air, but the core of the fortifications held. Each night, Rajput laborers would emerge from the gates under cover of darkness, hauling sacks of earth and rubble to pack into the damaged sections, shoring up the walls for the next day's onslaught. The siege settled into a grim rhythm. By day, the Moguls bombarded and probed, sending small assault parties forward to test the defenses, to search for weaknesses. By night, the Rajputs counterattacked. Jaimal Rathore proved to be a master of the night raid. Despite his crippled leg, he had to be carried on the shoulders of a retainer during battle. He led sorties out through the hidden sally ports, striking at Mughal artillery positions, supply depots, and command tents. His warriors would emerge from the darkness like ghosts, screaming war cries, hacking through sentries, setting fire to siege equipment, then vanishing back into the fortress before the Mughals could muster a response. Akbar lost count of how many guns were spiked, how many supply wagons torched, how many of his officers found with their throats slit in their own tents. The Rajputs fought with a ferocity born of desperation and pride, each raid a declaration: "We are still here. We are not afraid. Come and take us if you dare." But as October gave way to November, the relentless pressure began to tell. The Mughal artillery, despite the night raids, continued to pound the walls. Slowly, incrementally, cracks began to widen. Sections of the outer ramparts sagged. The defenders shifted their focus, abandoning the lower bastions one by one, falling back to the middle walls as the outer circuit became untenable. And then Akbar unleashed his engineers. Siege mining was an ancient art, but the Mughals had refined it to a science. Tunnels were dug from the Mughal siege lines toward the fortress walls, deep enough to evade detection, advancing foot by foot beneath the earth. Timber props supported the tunnel roofs. When the miners reached the foundation of a wall, they would hollow out a vast chamber, pack it with barrels of gunpowder, light the fuse, and flee. The first mine detonated in early November, beneath a section of the outer wall on the eastern face. The explosion was apocalyptic. A column of fire and debris shot 200 feet into the sky, and when the smoke cleared, a 50-foot section of rampart had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a smoking crater. Mughal assault troops surged forward, scrambling over the rubble, attempting to exploit the breach. But Jaimal had anticipated this. Rajput defenders, positioned behind hastily constructed inner barricades, met the Mughals with a storm of arrows and spears. The breach became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled upon bodies. The Mughals gained the outer wall for perhaps 2 hours before a counterattack led by Pada Sisodia himself drove them back, reclaiming the breach at the cost of 300 Rajput lives. Akbar ordered another mine. And another. And another. Each explosion shook the plateau like an earthquake. Each breach became a new battleground, soaked in blood, contested with a savagery that made seasoned warriors weep. The Rajputs held. But every defense cost lives, and they had no reinforcements. The Mughals, by contrast, seemed endless. November became December. The winter cold descended upon Rajasthan, bringing freezing nights and bitter winds. Inside the fortress, the first whispers of hunger began to circulate. The siege was now entering its third month, and the reality of attrition could no longer be ignored. Chittor's grain reserves, once thought sufficient to endure a year-long siege, were dwindling faster than anticipated. The 40,000 civilians sheltering within the walls consumed food at an alarming rate, and despite strict rationing imposed by Jaimal and Pata, the silos were emptying. Water was not yet a crisis. The fortress's ancient reservoirs were still adequate, but food was becoming a specter that haunted every council meeting. The secret supply tunnel, the lifeline that stretched beyond the walls to the ravine where Bill tribesmen waited with provisions, had been invaluable during the early weeks. But Mogul patrols were growing more aggressive, ranging farther into the surrounding hills, and several supply runs had been ambushed. The tribesmen, brave as they were, could not risk their lives indefinitely. The flow of supplies slowed to a trickle, then nearly stopped altogether. Meanwhile, the Mogul bombardment intensified. Akbar had brought up additional artillery from Agra, including several massive siege mortars capable of lobbing explosive shells over the walls and high arcs, descending like the wrath of God to detonate amidst the tightly packed buildings within the fortress. These shells were crude by later standards, cast iron spheres filled with gunpowder, fused with slow-burning cord, but their psychological impact was devastating. Civilians huddled in terror as the shells screamed overhead, never knowing where the next explosion would occur. Entire families were wiped out in single blasts. Temples were reduced to rubble. The Tower of Victory itself, that proud monument, bore scars from mortar strikes, its upper stories blackened and cratered. And still the Rajputs held. Jaimal Rathore became a figure of legend even as the siege unfolded. Despite his injury, his leg rendered useless by an old wound, he refused to remain in the inner citadel. Instead, he had himself carried on the shoulders of a giant Rajput warrior named Kalu, and together they would patrol the ramparts, Jaimal directing the defense, shouting encouragement, personally manning a heavy crossbow to snipe at Mughal officers visible in the siege lines below. His presence was a talisman. When word spread that Jaimal was on the walls, the defenders' spirits surged. They believed, with the fervor of the faithful, that so long as Jaimal lived, Chittor could not fall. Pata Sisodia was Jaimal's perfect complement. Where Jaimal was the grizzled veteran, Pata was youth and fury incarnate. He led every major counterattack, every desperate sally to reclaim a breached wall or destroy a siege engine. His blade seemed never to rest. Mughal soldiers whispered his name in fear, claiming he was a demon clothed in flesh, impossible to kill. In one engagement, Pata's personal guard was cut down to a man, and he fought alone for nearly an hour, surrounded, until Rajput reinforcements carved a path to him through the enemy. He emerged drenched in blood, none of it his own. But heroism, no matter how extraordinary, could not alter the mathematics of siege warfare. By late December, the outer walls were largely in Mughal hands. Explosive mines and relentless artillery had created so many breaches that defending them all was impossible. Jaimal made the agonizing decision to abandon the outer circuit entirely, pulling all remaining forces back to the middle walls. This bought time and shortened the defensive perimeter, but it also meant surrendering vast swathes of the fortress to the enemy. Mughal troops occupied the lower terraces, establishing forward positions within the fortress itself. Now they were inside the outer defenses, and the siege entered a new, even more brutal phase, close-quarters urban warfare within the labyrinth of Chittor's streets and buildings. Every structure became a miniature fortress. Every alley a killing zone. The Rajputs fought from rooftops, from windows, from behind barricades of rubble and overturned carts. Mughal soldiers advanced house by house, room by room, in grinding combat that devoured lives by the score. A single building might change hands 3 times in a day, each time leaving the floors slick with blood. Akbar, observing from his command ridge, grew increasingly frustrated. His casualties were mounting into the thousands. His officers reported that the Rajputs were fighting with suicidal determination, refusing to surrender even when surrounded and hopelessly outnumbered. Wounded Rajputs would crawl forward to stab at Mughal soldiers with daggers even as they bled out. Women and children threw stones and boiling oil from upper windows. This was not a battle, it was a descent into a shared madness of honor and violence. and yet the emperor could not withdraw. To do so would be to admit defeat, to embolden every other recalcitrant kingdom across his empire. Chittor had become a symbol, and symbols could not be allowed to stand defiant. Akbar ordered the siege to continue, no matter the cost. January arrived, and with it came the darkest days of the siege. Food within the fortress was now critically scarce. The last of the grain was being portioned out in handfuls per person per day. Soldiers ate leather, boiled belts and saddles into a foul stew. Horses and mules were slaughtered for meat. Children cried with hunger that could not be soothed. The civilian population, once 40,000 strong, had been reduced by disease, starvation, and Mughal bombardment to perhaps half that number. The stench of death hung over Chittor like a shroud. Bodies of the slain could not be properly cremated. There was no wood to spare, no time to conduct the rites. Mass graves were dug in the courtyards, but even these filled rapidly. Disease began to spread. Dysentery, cholera, fevers that burned men hollow from the inside. Jaimal and Patton knew the end was approaching. They could read it in the hollow eyes of their men, in the thinning ranks on the walls, in the empty granaries. The question was no longer whether Chittor would fall, but how it would fall. Would they surrender, beg for terms, hope for Akbar's mercy? Or would they choose the old way, the way of Jauhar and Saka, the annihilation of honor preserved through fire and final charge? There was never truly a choice. To be Rajput was to choose death over dishonor. In secret councils held in the inner citadel, the decision was made. When the final assault came, and it would come soon, the women and children would perform Jauhar, immolating themselves in the great pyres to escape capture. The men would don the saffron robes of martyrdom, anoint themselves with sacred ash, and ride out in the Saka, the last suicidal charge against the overwhelming enemy, seeking not victory but a glorious death. But even as these grim preparations were made, fate intervened in a manner both tragic and decisive. It was the night of the 22nd of February, 1568. Nearly 4 months had passed since the Mughal army had first encircled Chittor. 4 months of bombardment, mining, assault, counter-assault, starvation, and slaughter. The fortress still held, but only just. The middle walls bore the scars of 100 breaches, hastily repaired with rubble and prayer. The inner citadel remained intact, but it was crowded with the survivors of the lower wards, skeletal soldiers, starving civilians, the wounded who lay in rows waiting for death. Jaimal Rathore, indomitable as ever, was conducting his nightly inspection of the defenses. Despite the late hour, despite the exhaustion that etched lines deep into his face, he insisted on personally checking every bastion, every barricade, every sentry post. It was how he had maintained discipline and morale through these long months, by being always present, always vigilant, sharing every danger his men faced. On this particular night, he was overseeing the repair of a section of the middle wall that had been damaged in the day's bombardment. Rajput laborers, moving by torchlight, were stacking stones and packing earth to shore up the breach before dawn brought renewed Mughal assaults. Jaimal stood, or rather, was carried by his loyal retainer Kalu, at the edge of the parapet, directing the work, pointing out weaknesses, encouraging the exhausted men. What he did not know was that Akbar himself was watching. The emperor had taken to spending his nights on the observation ridge, unable to sleep, consumed by frustration and a growing obsession with breaking the fortress. On this night, he had with him a matchlock musket, a weapon he had personally crafted and modified, called Sangram, a finely wrought piece with a rifle barrel that granted it exceptional accuracy and range. Akbar was a skilled marksman, and he often used the long nights to practice, firing at targets within the fortress when the torchlight revealed them. Through the darkness, across nearly 400 yards of open ground, Akbar saw a figure silhouetted against a torch on Chittor's walls. A figure being carried, standing tall, gesturing with authority. Even at that distance, there was something unmistakable in the posture, the bearing. Akbar had heard the reports from his spies and captured prisoners. He knew of the crippled Rajput commander who led the defense from the shoulders of a giant. Jaimal. Akbar raised Sangram, steadying the barrel on a wooden rest. He took his time, compensating for distance, for the slight breeze, for the flickering torchlight that created dancing shadows. His finger curled around the trigger. He exhaled slowly. The musket roared, spitting flame into the night. 400 yards away, Jarmal Rathor jerked violently as the ball struck him in the forehead, punching through bone and brain, killing him instantly. He slumped forward, and Kalu, the giant retainer who bore him, felt the sudden dead weight and let out a howl of anguish that echoed across the plateau. The laborers froze, staring in horror as blood streamed from their commander's shattered skull. Jarmal Rathor, the terror of the Moguls, the soul of the defense, was dead. When word reached the inner citadel, the fortress descended into despair. Soldiers wept openly. Women tore at their hair and beat their breasts in grief. Jarmal had been more than a commander. He had been the living embodiment of their refusal to surrender, the proof that courage and skill could hold even against impossible odds. With him gone, the invisible thread that had bound the defenders together began to fray. Pata Sisodia, upon hearing the news, did not weep. His grief transmuted instantly into a cold, terrible fury. He summoned the surviving captains and nobles to the hall of the royal palace. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and hard as forged steel. Jamilji has fallen, he said. But Chitter still stands. And it will stand until we can stand no more. We will give the Moguls such a battle tomorrow that they will remember it for generations. We will make them pay in blood for every inch of ground. And when the end comes, and it will come, we will go to our deaths as Rajputs, in flame and fury, leaving nothing for them but ashes and corpses. There was no debate. No dissent. Every man in that hall knew the time had come. The order was given. The women, children, and elderly would gather in the great underground chambers where Jauhar had been performed twice before. Pyres would be built. Oil and ghee would be poured. At dawn, when the flames rose, the men would ride out in the final saka. That night, the women of Chitter sang hymns as they prepared for immolation. Mothers dressed their children in their finest clothes. Wives embraced husbands one last time. The air was thick with incense and sandalwood smoke, with prayers to Shiva and Durga, with the murmured farewells of those who knew they would not see another sunrise. Pata himself descended into the Jauhar chambers to bid farewell to his own wife and infant son. What words passed between them, no chronicle records. When he emerged, his eyes were dry but haunted, and he did not look back. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the Aravali hills on the 23rd of February, 1568, the fires were lit. The flames rose swiftly, feeding on oil and dry wood, roaring like a living beast. Thousands of women and children, dressed in their wedding silks and festival garments, walked willingly into the inferno, chanting mantras, their voices rising in a final chorus of defiance. The heat was so intense that soldiers on the walls, even hundreds of feet away, felt it scorch their faces. Smoke billowed upward in a great black column visible for miles. The Mughal soldiers, watching from their siege lines, fell silent. Even the most hardened veterans, men who had seen every manner of death and atrocity, were awed and horrified by the sight. An entire population choosing annihilation over surrender. And then, from within the fortress, the gates burst open. The Rajputs came forth clad in saffron robes, the color of martyrdom, their turbans bright as flame in the cold morning light. They came on horseback, those who still had mounts strong enough to bear them. They came on foot, limping, stumbling, but advancing nonetheless. They came bearing swords notched from months of battle, spears whose tips had been sharpened and resharpened until the blades were thin as needles, shields scarred and dented beyond recognition. They came singing war songs and voices hoarse from shouting commands, from breathing smoke, from starvation. They came to die. Pata Sisodia rode at the forefront, mounted on a skeletal warhorse that somehow still had the strength to charge. Beside him were the last surviving nobles of Muir, the sons of ancient clans whose lineages stretched back centuries. Behind them surged the remnants of the garrison, perhaps 3,000 men still capable of fighting, out of the 8,000 who had begun the siege 4 months prior. 3,000 ghosts in saffron, already dead in their hearts, seeking only to choose the manner of their death. The Saka was not a tactical maneuver. It was ritual. It was theater. It was the Rajput soul made manifest in one final, suicidal gesture of defiance. They did not expect to break the Mughal army. They did not expect to escape. They expected to kill as many of the enemy as they could before being cut down, to make Akbar's victory so costly that he would choke on the ashes of it. And by the gods, they succeeded. The Mughal lines, expecting another desperate sortie like the ones that had harried them for months, formed up to receive the charge. But this was different. The Rajputs did not strike and retreat. They plunged into the Mughal formations with the force of a collapsing star, hacking and slashing with abandon, ignoring wounds, ignoring death, driven by a berserker fury that no amount of discipline could withstand. Pata himself cut down 17 men in the first minutes of the charge. His sword moved in arcs too fast to follow, opening throats, severing limbs, splitting skulls. Around him, his warriors fought with identical ferocity. A Rajput with half his face blown away by a musket ball continued fighting, wielding his sword with one hand while holding his shattered jaw in place with the other. Another, disemboweled by a spear thrust, wrapped his entrails around his waist and charged forward, screaming war cries until his heart finally stopped. The Mughals broke. Not all of them, Akbar's elite troops, his veteran cavalry, held firm. But the levies, the camp followers pressed into service, the less experienced soldiers, they broke and ran, trampling each other in their panic to escape the saffron-robed demons who seemed immune to pain and death. For a brief, glorious moment, it seemed as though the Rajputs might actually rout the entire Mughal army through sheer ferocity. But numbers will always tell in the end. The Mughal cavalry reformed, encircling the charging Rajputs, cutting off their advance. Artillery crews, who had been loading canister shot in anticipation of an assault, fired point-blank into the Saka. Each cannon blast tore through dozens of men, shredding flesh and bone, leaving craters of red ruin in the saffron tide. Musket volleys crashed like thunder, dropping Rajputs by the score. And still they came forward. Pata, his horse shot out from under him, continued on foot. He gathered a knot of 50 warriors around him and led them in a wedge formation directly toward Akbar's command position, perhaps hoping to kill the emperor himself and make this slaughter mean something more than martyrdom. They carved through 2 lines of infantry, broke a cavalry squadron, came within 200 yards of Akbar's tent. But the Mughal reserves crashed into them like a tidal wave, overwhelming them through sheer mass. Pata fought until his sword broke. Then he fought with the hilt. Then with a spear ripped from a dead man's hands. Then with a dagger. Then with his bare fists, punching and clawing until a Mughal cavalryman's lance took him through the chest, lifting him off the ground, pinning him to the earth. He died with his eyes open, staring at the sky, his lips moving in a final prayer. Around him, the Saka disintegrated. The last of the Rajputs fell in groups, in pairs, singly, pulled down by weight of numbers. Some fought until they collapsed from blood loss. Others, when no enemy was within reach, drove their own blades into their bellies, performing the ritual suicide of seppuku that the Rajputs called tragu, denying the enemy even the satisfaction of the kill. Within 2 hours, it was over. 3,000 Rajputs lay dead or dying on the blood-soaked ground before Chittor's gates. Mughal casualties were staggering. Estimates range from 5,000 to 8,000 killed or wounded in the Saka alone, more losses than the Mughals had sustained in the entire 4-month siege up to that point. Entire companies had been mauled. Officers had been cut down. Akbar himself had come perilously close to death. But the Rajputs were gone. Every last warrior who had participated in the Saka was dead. And Chittor stood empty. Mughal troops, advancing cautiously, found the gates undefended. They poured into the fortress, expecting ambushes, traps, a final desperate resistance. Instead, they found silence. The streets were deserted. The palaces abandoned. And from the underground chambers, the heat of the Jauhar still radiated, the great pyres reduced to beds of glowing embers amidst which lay the charred remains of thousands. Akbar entered Chittor on the evening of the 23rd of February. Walking through streets littered with the debris of battle, past buildings scarred by cannon fire, past the Tower of Victory that still bore its proud inscriptions despite the damage. He ascended to the inner citadel and stood in the courtyard of the royal palace, staring down at the city he had conquered. But it was a hollow victory. There was no one left to rule. No population to tax. No hostages to parade in triumph. The Rajputs had given him stones and ashes. In his frustration and rage, Akbar ordered a massacre. Any civilians found hiding, and some had hidden, in cellars, in cisterns, in the secret tunnels, were dragged out and executed. Mughal sources claim 30,000 were put to the sword in the days following the fall. Rajput sources claim the number was higher. Modern historians debate the figures, but all agree Chittor's population was effectively annihilated. Akbar also ordered the execution of the captured wounded, those Rajputs too injured to participate in the Saka who had been left behind. They were beheaded in groups, their heads piled into pyramids outside the fortress gates as a warning to any who might dare resist the Mughal Empire in the future. And then, to ensure Chittor could never again serve as a symbol of defiance, Akbar ordered the fortress partially demolished. Sections of the walls were pulled down. Palaces were torched. The reservoirs were poisoned. Chittor was to be left as a ruin, a monument to the futility of resistance. The immediate aftermath of the siege was chaos rendered into policy, grief transmuted into imperial decree. Akbar remained at Chittor for 3 weeks following the fall, overseeing the systematic dismantling of the fortress's capacity to ever again serve as a bastion of Rajput resistance. Mughal engineers worked day and night, identifying structural weaknesses, placing explosive charges in the foundations of key bastions and towers. Controlled demolitions brought down entire sections of the outer and middle walls, creating yawning gaps that would require years of labor to repair, labor that Akbar had no intention of permitting. The Tower of Victory, that 9-story monument to past glories, was spared, not out of mercy, but out of pragmatism. It served as a convenient landmark, and more importantly, it now stood as a testament to Mughal might. Let it remain, Akbar decreed, but let it stand in a city of ghosts, a reminder that defiance brings only ruin. The wealth of Chittor, what little remained after months of siege, was catalogued and seized. Gold and silver vessels from the temples were melted down and stamped with Mughal insignia. Precious stones were pried from palace walls and sent to Agra to adorn the imperial treasury. Libraries were ransacked. Some rare manuscripts were preserved for Akbar's personal collection, for he fancied himself a patron of learning, but many others were simply burned. And the bodies were beyond counting. Mughal soldiers tasked with clearing the fortress worked in shifts, dragging corpses to mass graves dug beyond the walls. The stench was apocalyptic. Crows and vultures descended in flocks so vast they darkened the sky, gorging themselves until they could barely fly. Disease broke out among the Mughal army itself. Cholera and typhus spread through the camps, killing hundreds more soldiers even in victory. But Akbar's mind was already elsewhere. He had broken Chittor, yes, but Muir itself remained unconquered. Rana Uday Singh had escaped, and even now was rallying forces in the Aravalli hills. The Muir kingdom, bloodied and diminished, still existed. Moreover, the brutality of Chittor's fall had sent shockwaves across Rajputana. Other Rajput clans, even those who had entered into alliances with the Mughals, watched with a mixture of horror and grim admiration. The siege of Chittor became a story told around every fire, a ballad sung by every bard. The Jauhar of 1568 joined the Jauhar of 1303 and 1535 in the pantheon of Rajput martyrdom, a narrative of honor preserved through sacrifice. And narratives, Akbar knew, could be as dangerous as armies. In March of 1568, the emperor finally departed Chittor, leaving a token garrison to hold the ruins. He returned to Agra in a triumph that was muted by the cost. Yes, he had conquered the fortress. Yes, he had demonstrated that no stronghold, no matter how formidable, could withstand the full might of the Mughal Empire. But he had lost thousands of soldiers, expended a fortune in gunpowder and supplies, and earned a reputation for ruthlessness that complicated his efforts to win over other Rajput kingdoms through diplomacy rather than force. The siege of Chittor was a victory, but it was a victory that tasted of ashes. For Muir, the fall of Chittor was a catastrophe, but not the end. Rana Uday Singh, upon receiving news of the fortress's fall and the deaths of Jaimal and Pada, entered into a period of mourning that lasted 40 days. But he did not surrender. Instead, he redoubled his efforts to build a new capital, one that could not be besieged in the manner Chittor had been. He chose a site deep in the Aravalli range, in a valley surrounded by steep hills and fed by the waters of Lake Pichola. He named it Udaipur, after himself. And he appointed a new heir. His son, Pratap. Maharana Pratap, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated figures in Rajput history, was only 27 years old when Chittor fell. The siege shaped him in ways both profound and terrible. He had not been present at Chittor. He had been with his father, helping to establish the new capital, but the loss of the fortress, the deaths of Jaimal and Pada, the horror of the Jauhar, all of it burned into his soul like a brand. Pratap swore an oath that he would never rest in a palace, never sleep on a bed, never eat from gold or silver plates, until Chittor was reclaimed from the Mughals. It was a vow he would keep for the rest of his life, dwelling in forest camps, eating off leaves, waging guerrilla warfare against the empire that had humiliated his kingdom. But that is a story for another telling. In the immediate wake of the siege, Mewar was in no position to wage war. The kingdom had lost its capital, its greatest fortress, and the cream of its warrior nobility. Rana Uday Singh died in 1572, worn down by grief and exhaustion, and Pratap inherited a shattered realm. Yet the siege of Chittor also created a legacy that transcended military defeat. The story of Jaimal and Pada, of the 8,000 who held against 200,000, of the Jauhar and Saka, became a foundational myth of Rajput identity. It was proof that courage and honor mattered more than victory, that dying well was preferable to living dishonored. Akbar himself, despite the brutality he had unleashed, came to respect the defenders of Chittor. In later years, he commissioned statues of Jaimal and Pada to be erected at the gates of Agra fort, honoring them as worthy enemies. It was an extraordinary gesture, raising monuments to men who had defied him, but it spoke to Akbar's understanding that empires are built not only on conquest but on the narratives that justify and legitimize that conquest. By honoring the Rajput defenders, he positioned himself not as a tyrant, but as a magnanimous sovereign who admired courage even in his enemies. The political calculus of the siege's outcome was complex and long-lasting. In the short term, Chittor's fall did indeed consolidate Mughal dominance over Rajputana. The other Rajput kingdoms, seeing what had happened to Mewar, were more inclined to negotiate, to accept Mughal suzerainty in exchange for autonomy and honors. The matrimonial alliances between Mughal emperors and Rajput princesses, which had begun under Akbar's father, expanded and deepened, creating a hybrid Mughal-Rajput elite that would govern much of northern India for generations. But Mewar never truly submitted. Pratap's guerrilla campaigns kept the flame of resistance alive, and though he never recaptured Chittor, he did manage to reclaim much of the surrounding countryside, forcing the Mughals to pour resources into endless counterinsurgency operations. The siege of Chittor, in this sense, did not end in 1568, it merely transitioned into a different kind of warfare, one that would smolder for decades. And the fortress itself? Chittor was never fully reoccupied. The Mughals kept a small garrison there for some years, but maintaining a ruined fortress in hostile territory proved impractical and costly. Eventually, they abandoned it. The Rajputs did not return either. Pratap's vow to reclaim it remained unfulfilled, and later generations of Mewar rulers, based in Udaipur, had no desire to rebuild a site associated with such immense tragedy. Chittor became a pilgrimage site, a place of memory. Travelers would visit to pay homage to the martyrs, to stand in the Jauhar chambers where the flames had consumed thousands, to walk the ramparts where Jaimal and Pada had made their last stands. The ruins took on a sacred quality, a temple not to any god but to the idea of Rajput honor. Centuries have passed since the smoke cleared from Chittor's walls, and yet the siege remains etched into the cultural memory of India with a clarity that few other historical events can match. For the Rajputs, Chittor became the ultimate symbol of their warrior ethos, the proof that their values, honor, courage, sacrifice, were worth dying for. Every child raised in a Rajput household learned the story of the siege. Every prince was taught to emulate Jaimal and Pada, to hold to one's principles even unto death. The concept of Jauhar, as horrifying as it might appear to modern sensibilities, was enshrined as the ultimate expression of female honor, a refusal to allow one's purity to be defiled by the enemy. This veneration was not without its critics, even in the centuries immediately following the siege. Some Indian historians and philosophers questioned whether dying in a hopeless defense served any practical purpose, whether it might not have been wiser to retreat, to preserve the kingdom's strength for future battles. But such voices were drowned out by the overwhelming cultural weight of the martyrdom narrative. To question Chittor was to question the very foundations of Rajput identity. For the Mughals, the siege was remembered with a more ambivalent mixture of pride and discomfort. Pride because it demonstrated the empire's military prowess, its ability to bring even the most formidable fortress to heel. Discomfort because the cost had been so staggering, and because Akbar's brutality in the aftermath had complicated his later efforts to present himself as a just and tolerant ruler. Akbar's grandson, Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal, is said to have visited Chittor once during his reign. He walked through the ruins in silence, and when asked what he thought, he replied, "This place is a monument to the limits of imperial power. We may conquer fortresses, but we cannot conquer the spirit that animates them." It was an uncommonly philosophical statement from an emperor whose reign was marked by both architectural grandeur and ruthless political maneuvering. The British, when they arrived in India centuries later and began compiling their histories of the subcontinent, were fascinated by Chittor. British officers, steeped in the romantic ideals of the 19th century, saw in the siege echoes of classical epics like the Iliad or the defense of Thermopylae. They wrote extensively about Jaimal and Pada, sometimes with more admiration than they accorded to their contemporary Indian opponents. James Todd, the British administrator and historian who chronicled Rajasthan in the early 1800s, devoted an entire chapter of his Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan to the siege of Chittor, describing it as one of the most glorious defenses in the annals of any nation. Yet even Todd, for all his admiration, could not quite grasp the full cultural significance of what had transpired. To him, it was a tragic but ultimately futile gesture, a waste of brave men's lives in service of an outdated code of honor. He viewed it through the lens of British military pragmatism, which valued strategic withdrawal and regrouping over martyrdom. He did not, perhaps could not, understand that for the Rajputs, the siege was not a failure. It was a triumph of values over circumstances, a demonstration that there are things worth dying for even when victory is impossible. The 20th century brought renewed interest in Chittor as India grappled with questions of identity and nationhood in the wake of independence from British rule. Nationalist historians held up the siege as an example of Indian resistance to foreign invaders, conveniently eliding the fact that the invaders had by Akbar's time been in India for generations and considered themselves as Indian as anyone else. The narrative of Chittor was retrofitted to serve contemporary political purposes, transformed from a story of Rajput valor into a story of Hindu resistance to Muslim conquest. This communalization of the siege's memory has been one of the more troubling legacies of Chittor. In truth, the siege was not primarily a religious conflict. Akbar's army included many Hindu Rajputs fighting under Mughal banners, and Nur's cause was as much about dynastic pride and regional autonomy as about religion. But in the heated sectarian politics of modern India, such nuances are often lost. The fortress itself, meanwhile, has been preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists from around the world come to walk its ramparts, to stand in the Jauhar chambers, to photograph the Tower of Victory rising against the Rajasthani sky. Plaques and markers identify the key sites: the place where Jaimal fell, the gate from which the Saka emerged, the palace where Pada made his last stand. It is both a museum and a memorial, a place where history is simultaneously preserved and commodified. And yet, for all the tourism and the historical scholarship, there is still something haunting about Chittor. Stand on its walls at dusk, when the light is fading and the wind sighs through the ruined buildings, and you can almost hear the echoes of that long-ago siege. The boom of artillery, the clash of swords, the roar of the flames. the cries of the dying. Perhaps it is mere imagination, the human tendency to project narrative onto silent stones. Or perhaps places where great suffering has occurred retain some imprint, some residual weight of memory that can be felt even by those who know nothing of the history. Chittor endures. Not as a living city, not as a functioning fortress, but as an idea. An idea about honor, about resistance, about the price of defiance. Different people draw different lessons from it. Some see nobility in the defender's choice to die rather than submit. Others see tragedy in the waste of so many lives. Still others see a cautionary tale about the dangers of inflexible adherence to codes of honor in a world that has moved beyond them. All of these interpretations have validity. History does not come with a single correct reading. The siege of Chittor means something different to a Rajput descendant of the defenders, to a Mughal historian, to a British romantic, to a modern Indian nationalist, to a foreign tourist with no cultural investment in the narrative. But what cannot be disputed is the siege's magnitude, its ferocity, and its lasting impact on the region's history. It was one of the longest and bloodiest sieges of the early modern period. It demonstrated the limits of fortress warfare in the age of gunpowder. It marked a turning point in Mughal relations with the Rajput kingdoms. And it created a martyrdom narrative that would shape Rajput identity for centuries to come. The question that lingers, the question that each generation must answer for itself, is whether the defense of Chittor was worth the cost. 8,000 warriors dead. 30,000 or more civilians dead. A kingdom shattered. A fortress left in ruins. All to avoid surrender, to preserve honor in the face of overwhelming force. Was it worth it? To Jaimal and Pata, standing on those walls in the final days, watching the Mughal army arrayed against them, knowing that death was certain and victory impossible, the answer was yes. Honor was worth dying for. Defiance was worth dying for. The right to choose one's own fate, even if that fate was annihilation, was worth dying for. And in making that choice, they ensured that their names would echo through history, that their story would be told and retold, that the siege of Chittor would become not merely an event but a legend, a myth, a symbol of something larger than themselves. That, perhaps, was the true victory. To understand why the defenders of Chittor made the choices they did, one must delve deeper into the cultural and philosophical context of Rajput society in the 16th century, a world where honor was currency, where lineage was identity, and where death was preferable to dishonor. The Rajputs traced their origins to the warrior clans of ancient India, the Kshatriya caste whose dharma, religious and moral duty, was to fight, to protect, and if necessary, to die in battle. This was not merely tradition, it was cosmic law, woven into the fabric of Hindu cosmology. A Kshatriya who died in battle was promised immediate ascension to Indra's heaven, Svarga, where he would dwell among the gods and heroes of legend. By contrast, a warrior who fled from battle or surrendered to an enemy was condemned to reincarnate in a lower form, perhaps as an animal or an outcast, forced to claw his way back up through countless lifetimes. This belief system created a culture in which battlefield courage was not merely admired but religiously mandated. To die fighting was salvation. To live in dishonor was damnation. Layered atop this Hindu theological framework was the specifically Rajput code of honor, a warrior ethic that emphasized personal glory, loyalty to one's clan and lord, and the defense of one's honor and that of one's women. The Rajputs had absorbed influences from the Islamic warrior cultures they had been fighting for centuries. There were echoes of Sufi mysticism, of the Persian chivalric ideal, blended with indigenous Hindu concepts. The result was a syncretic warrior code that prized martyrdom, generosity, loyalty, and an almost aristocratic sense of noblesse oblige. Central to this code was the concept of izzat, honor, prestige, reputation. A man's izzat was his most valuable possession, more precious than land, wealth, or even life itself. To lose one's izzat through cowardice, treachery, or the defilement of one's women was to become less than human, a walking corpse unworthy of respect. And izzat was communal. A man did not merely possess his own honor, he carried the honor of his clan, his ancestors, his descendants yet unborn. To act dishonorably was to stain not only oneself but one's entire lineage. Conversely, to die gloriously was to elevate the entire clan, to give future generations a story to tell, a legacy to live up to. This is why Jauhar and Saka were not seen as tragedies by the Rajputs, but as triumphs. The women who chose immolation rather than capture were not victims. They were heroines, preserving their purity and the honor of their families. The men who charged to certain death were not wasting their lives. They were fulfilling their dharma, ensuring their place in paradise, and giving their clans a story that would be told for generations. It was a worldview that placed values above survival, narrative above outcome, honor above pragmatism. Of course, not every Rajput lived up to this ideal. History is full of Rajput rulers who surrendered, who entered into alliances with the Mughals, who chose survival over suicide. But they did so at great cost to their Izzat, and their descendants often spent generations trying to rehabilitate their reputations through martial exploits. The ideal remained powerful precisely because it was an ideal, a standard against which all actions were measured. The siege of Chittor in this context was the ultimate test of Rajput values. When Jaimal and Pata chose to defend the fortress unto death, when the women chose Jauhar, when the warriors chose Saka, they were not acting irrationally. They were acting in perfect accordance with the deepest principles of their culture. To have chosen otherwise, to have surrendered, to have begged for terms, would have been to negate their entire identities, to render their lives meaningless. Akbar, for his part, understood this. He was frustrated by it, infuriated by it, but he understood it. This is why, despite his brutality in the immediate aftermath of the siege, he later honored Jaimal and Pata with statues at Agra Fort. He recognized that he had faced not merely an enemy, but an opposing philosophy, a different conception of what makes life meaningful. And in his more reflective moments, he may even have envied it. For all his power, for all his conquests, Akbar was a man troubled by doubts, by questions about the purpose of empire, about the legacy he would leave. The defenders of Chittor had no such doubts. They knew exactly who they were and what they stood for, and they were willing to die for it. This clarity of purpose, this absolute certainty, is perhaps what makes the siege of Chittor so compelling even now, centuries removed from the event. In a modern world characterized by moral ambiguity, by compromise and negotiation, by the erosion of grand narratives and absolute values, there is something strangely attractive about a story where the lines are so clearly drawn, where the choices are so stark, where people act with such utter conviction. But it is also what makes the siege so troubling. Because the flip side of absolute conviction is fanaticism, and the flip side of honor culture is cruelty. The same code that produced the heroism of Jaimal and Pata also produced the horror of Jauhar, the immolation of thousands of women and children who may or may not have truly chosen that fate, who may have been swept up in a collective frenzy or coerced by cultural expectations they could not resist. Modern feminists and human rights advocates have rightly pointed out the problematic aspects of venerating Jauhar. It was, after all, a practice that denied women agency, that defined their worth entirely in terms of their sexual purity, that treated them as property to be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands. The glorification of Jauhar as an act of female heroism obscures its fundamental nature as a form of gendered violence. Yet to judge the past entirely by present-day standards is also problematic. The women of Chittor lived in a world utterly unlike our own, a world where capture by an enemy army meant almost certain sexual enslavement, torture, and degradation. Given the limited choices available to them within their cultural context, Jauhar may indeed have seemed like the least terrible option. To condemn them for that choice is to impose our values on a situation we can never fully understand. The siege of Chittor thus remains morally complex, resistant to easy judgment. It was an act of extraordinary courage and also an act of extraordinary waste. It was a triumph of the human spirit, and also a tragedy of ideological rigidity. It was glorious and it was horrific, often simultaneously. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of Chittor. That history does not divide neatly into heroes and villains, into right and wrong. That people can act with the noblest of intentions and still create outcomes of immense suffering. That cultures can produce both sublime beauty and terrible cruelty, sometimes from the same values. Akbar went on to rule for nearly 4 more decades after Chittor, his reign remembered as one of the greatest in Indian history. He expanded the empire, reformed the administration, patronized the arts and scholarship, attempted to create a syncretic religion that would unite Hindus and Muslims. He is often called Akbar the Great, and with good reason. But he never forgot Chittor. In his later years, he is said to have admitted that the siege was one of the few campaigns he regretted, not because he lost, he hadn't, but because the victory felt hollow. He had gained a pile of rubble and a legacy of brutality, either of which served his larger goal of winning the loyalty and affection of his Hindu subjects. The strategic implications of the siege of Chittor rippled outward across the Indian subcontinent, reshaping the balance of power in ways both immediate and long-lasting. In the immediate aftermath, Akbar's successful reduction of the fortress sent a clear message to every other recalcitrant kingdom: resistance was futile. The Mughal Empire possessed the resources, the military technology, and the sheer determination to reduce any stronghold, no matter how formidable. This psychological impact was perhaps more valuable than the physical conquest of Chittor itself. Within a few years, several Rajput kingdoms that had been holding out against Mughal overtures, Marwar, Bikaner, Jaisalmer, entered into formal alliances with the empire, accepting Mughals' suzerainty in exchange for internal autonomy and positions of honor within the imperial hierarchy. This policy of co-opting Rajput elites through matrimonial alliances and military appointments became a cornerstone of Mughal governance. Rajput princes were given high ranks in the Mansabdari system, granted jagars, land grants that provided revenue, and integrated into the imperial nobility. Their daughters married Mughal princes, creating a hybrid Mughal-Rajput aristocracy that dominated northern India for generations. This integration was so successful that by the time of Akbar's death in 1605, Rajputs formed one of the largest contingents in the Mughal army and held some of the most important administrative positions in the empire. But Muir remained the exception. Despite the fall of Chittor, despite the death of Rana Uday Singh, the kingdom refused to submit. Maharana Pratap, who succeeded his father in 1572, took the legacy of Chittor and weaponized it. He turned the story of the siege into a rallying cry, a proof that Muir would never bow, never compromise, never accept Mughal overlordship no matter the cost. Pratap's guerrilla campaign against the Mughals became legendary in its own right. Operating from the Aravalli Hills, with a force that rarely numbered more than a few thousand men, he harried Mughal garrisons, ambushed supply convoys, and made it nearly impossible for the empire to fully pacify the region. The Battle of Haldigati in 1576, where Pratap's forces clashed with a much larger Mughal army under Man Singh I, ended in a tactical defeat for Muir but a strategic stalemate. Pratap escaped, and though he lost much of his remaining territory, he never surrendered. For the rest of his life, Pratap lived in forest camps, eating off leaves, refusing to sleep in a bed or live in a palace, honoring the vow he had made after Chittor fell. He died in 1597, still unbowed, still defiant. And though he never recaptured Chittor, his resistance ensured that Muir retained a measure of independence, a psychological victory that mattered more than territorial control. The Mughals, for their part, eventually gave up trying to fully subdue Muir. The cost in resources and manpower was simply too high for a kingdom that had already been reduced to a shadow of its former power. A pragmatic détente emerged. Muir was allowed to remain de facto autonomous as long as it didn't actively rebel, and the Mughals focused their expansionist energies elsewhere, conquering the Deccan sultanates and pushing into southern India. This uneasy coexistence persisted for generations. It was only in the 17th century, during the reign of Akbar's grandson Jahangir, that a formal peace was finally negotiated. Muir agreed to acknowledge Mughal suzerainty, but on terms that preserved the kingdom's dignity. No Muir princess would marry a Mughal, no Muir Raja would be required to appear personally at the Mughal court, and internal affairs would remain under Muir's control. It was a compromise that both sides could accept, ending a conflict that had simmered for nearly half a century since the fall of Chittor. But the memory of the siege never faded. For Muir's rulers and people, Chittor remained the spiritual capital even as Udaipur served as the administrative one. Annual commemorations were held at the fortress to honor the martyrs. Poets and bards composed ballads recounting the exploits of Jaimal and Pada, the suffering of the Jauhar, the glory of the Saka. These ballads were performed at weddings, festivals, and court gatherings, keeping the memory alive across generations. The cult of Chittor also shaped Muir's foreign policy well into the modern era. Even during the period of British colonialism, when most Indian princely states pragmatically aligned with the British Raj in exchange for protection and privileges, Muir maintained a reputation for pride and independence. The state's rulers invoked Chittor's legacy to justify a cautious, sometimes prickly relationship with the British, insisting on respect and formal protocol in a way that other, larger states did not. Interestingly, the British were often more sympathetic to this stance than one might expect. British officers, many of whom were classically educated and steeped in romantic notions of chivalry and honor, saw the Rajputs generally and Muir specifically as the Indian equivalent of medieval European knights. They admired the siege of Chittor in much the same way they admired the Battle of Thermopylae or the defense of Masada, as a glorious defeat, a testament to the nobility of lost causes. This Orientalist romanticism, while often condescending, did grant Muir a certain prestige within the British Raj's hierarchy of princely states. The economic consequences of the siege were also profound, though less dramatic than the political ones. Chittor had been not only a fortress but a major urban center, a hub of trade and artisanal production. Its destruction disrupted regional trade networks, impoverishing the surrounding countryside. The population that had fled or been killed during the siege took decades to be replaced. Agricultural production in the region declined sharply in the years following 1568, contributing to famines and economic instability. Ironically, this devastation may have contributed to Muir's ability to resist Mughal pacification. With Chittor destroyed and the population dispersed into the hills, there were fewer fixed assets for the Mughals to capture or control. Pratap's guerrilla forces could live off the land, supplied by sympathetic villagers, moving constantly to avoid Mughal columns. The very poverty of the region made it less valuable to conquer and more difficult to hold, creating conditions favorable to insurgency. In the longer term, the economic center of Muir shifted permanently. Udaipur, the new capital founded by Rana Uday Singh, grew into a thriving city in its own right, known for its artificial lakes, palaces, and as a center of Rajput art and culture. But it never had the symbolic weight of Chittor. It was a pragmatic choice, a functional capital, but not the soul of the kingdom. Chittor remained the soul. And souls, as the Rajputs understood, cannot be conquered. They can only be honored or desecrated, remembered or forgotten. The Mughals might hold the physical ruins of the fortress, but the idea of Chittor, what it represented, what it meant, belonged to Muir forever. This distinction between physical control and ideological possession is central to understanding why the siege mattered far more than its immediate military outcome might suggest. In purely material terms, Akbar gained very little from the conquest of Chittor. The fortress was too damaged to be easily repaired, too costly to maintain, and too deeply associated with Rajput resistance to ever be a reliable Mughal stronghold. He would have been better off bypassing it entirely, isolating it through diplomacy and letting it wither. But empires do not operate solely on material calculations. They operate on symbols, on narratives of power and legitimacy. Akbar needed to conquer Chittor to prove that the Mughal Empire could not be defied with impunity, that fortresses and honor codes and suicidal valor were no match for imperial might. He needed the victory, however costly, to maintain the narrative of Mughal invincibility. And he got it. But the cost was such that the victory became tainted, associated forever with brutality and waste. The siege of Chittor was a Pyrrhic victory in the truest sense, a success that damaged the victor nearly as much as the vanquished. The military tactics employed during the siege of Chittor reveal much about the state of warfare in 16th century India, a period of transition as traditional medieval siege methods collided with the emerging technologies of the gunpowder age. Akbar's siege train was among the most sophisticated in Asia at the time. The Mughals had inherited gunpowder technology from both the Timurids of Central Asia and the Ottomans, with whom they maintained diplomatic and commercial ties. Mughal bronze cannons, cast using advanced metallurgical techniques, were capable of sustained bombardment over days or weeks without bursting, a significant improvement over the more primitive artillery of earlier eras. The siege guns deployed at Chittor included both direct-fire pieces, used to batter walls, and high-angle mortars, designed to lob explosive shells over fortifications to terrorize the defenders and destroy buildings within. The mortars were particularly effective at Chittor, where the elevation of the plateau made direct artillery fire difficult against the upper walls but left the interior of the fortress vulnerable to plunging fire. Yet for all their sophistication, these guns were still limited by the logistics of the era. Each major cannon required a team of oxen or elephants to transport, and once emplaced, it was difficult to move again. Gunpowder was expensive and had to be manufactured on-site or hauled from distant arsenals. Cannonballs had to be standardized to fit each gun, requiring skilled blacksmiths and access to iron. A sustained bombardment consumed resources at an astonishing rate. This is one reason why the siege lasted 4 months. Akbar could not simply blast the walls into rubble overnight. He had to ration his ammunition, coordinate his bombardments with infantry assaults to maximize their effect, and constantly adapt as the defenders repaired damaged sections. Siege warfare in this period was as much a battle of logistics and endurance as of firepower. Mining, tunneling beneath walls to plant explosives, was equally complex and dangerous. Mughal engineers had to dig in secret, ideally concealing the tunnel entrances behind siege works or natural terrain features. The tunnels had to be shored up with timber to prevent collapse, and ventilation was a constant problem. Miners often suffocated or were poisoned by fumes from their lamps. Countermining by defenders, who would dig their own tunnels to intercept attackers or to listen for the sounds of digging, turned the siege into a three-dimensional chess game played in darkness and clay. The Rajputs, for their part, employed every defensive tactic known to medieval warfare. They poured boiling oil and molten lead on attackers trying to scale the walls. They launched sorties to destroy siege equipment. They rolled massive boulders down the slopes to crush advancing infantry. Archers and musketeers on the ramparts kept up a steady fire, making any approach to the walls deadly. But the Rajputs' most effective tactic was psychological. The night raids, the refusal to surrender, the willingness to die rather than yield, all of this wore down Mughal morale in ways that mere military competence could not. Siege warfare is tedious and demoralizing even in the best circumstances. Soldiers spend weeks or months camped in the same spot, enduring harsh weather, inadequate rations, disease, and the constant threat of sudden attack. The longer a siege drags on, the more restive and mutinous the besieging army becomes. Akbar had to deal with multiple small mutinies during the Chittor campaign. As soldiers grumbled about the endless casualties, the lack of plunder, the Rajputs had evacuated most of their wealth, and the sheer frustration of fighting an enemy who refused to behave rationally by surrendering when clearly beaten. The emperor's personal presence at the siege was in part an attempt to maintain discipline through sheer force of will and charisma. The tactical mistake that ultimately broke the siege was not a grand strategic blunder but a small, almost trivial error: Jamal's decision to personally oversee wall repairs at night, in a location visible from Akbar's observation post, with torches that silhouetted him against the darkness. It was carelessness born of exhaustion and desperation. After nearly 4 months of siege, even the most disciplined commander can slip, can forget to take the precautions that in calmer times would be second nature. Jamal had conducted dozens of such inspections over the course of the siege without incident. But on that one night, at that one moment, conditions aligned: the torch, the visibility, Akbar with his rifle, the steady hand and keen eye. One shot. And everything changed. The death of Jamal was the domino that set all the others toppling. Without him, the defense lost its organizing genius, the man who coordinated repairs, planned counterattacks, maintained morale through personal example. Pata was brave and capable, but he lacked Jamal's decades of experience, his almost preternatural ability to sense where the next Mughal blow would fall and counter it. Within 24 hours of Jamal's death, the decision was made to perform Jauhar and Saka. It was a recognition that the siege could not be prolonged much longer, that with Jaimal gone and supplies exhausted, the end was inevitable. Better to choose the manner and timing of that end than to wait for the Mughals to choose it for them. This is the essence of the tactical mistake that flipped the campaign. Not a mass charge into a trap, not a betrayal by an ally, not a wall collapsing at the wrong moment, but a single rifle shot that killed the one man whose leadership held the defense together. In warfare, individuals matter. Leadership matters. And sometimes, the outcome of a campaign hinging on months of effort and the lives of tens of thousands can turn on something as simple and random as a torch casting a shadow in the night. Akbar himself seemed to understand the significance of what he had done. Chroniclers record that he boasted of the shot. Marksmanship was a skill he prided himself on, but also that in later years, he expressed a kind of regret. Killing Jaimal in open battle would have been glorious. Shooting him from ambush, even if technically within the rules of siege warfare, felt like cheating. It was a victory, but not an honorable one. And for Akbar, honor mattered. He was, despite his power and ruthlessness, a man shaped by the same honor culture as the Rajputs, albeit filtered through Persian and Central Asian traditions. The tension between pragmatism and honor, between doing what was necessary to win and doing what was honorable, haunted him throughout his reign. The siege of Chittor encapsulated this tension perfectly. He won. He broke the fortress. He demonstrated imperial might. But in doing so, he committed acts: the massacre of civilians, the destruction of a sacred site, the assassination of a crippled warrior, that tarnished his reputation and complicated his legitimacy. It was a lesson that future empire builders would learn and relearn across the centuries. Sometimes, the cost of victory exceeds the value of what is won. The human cost of the siege of Chittor is difficult to quantify with precision, but all sources agree it was staggering beyond measure. Conservative estimates place Rajput military deaths at around 8,000, essentially the entire garrison that remained after Rana Uday Singh's departure. To this must be added the civilian deaths, the thousands who died in the Jauhar, the thousands more killed by bombardment, disease, and starvation during the siege, and the tens of thousands massacred in the aftermath when Akbar's soldiers were unleashed upon any survivors found hiding in the ruins. Mughal losses are harder to ascertain. Court chroniclers, whose job was to glorify the emperor, tended to minimize or omit friendly casualties. But fragmentary evidence suggests the Mughals lost anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 soldiers over the course of the 4-month siege and the final Saka. Some estimates run even higher when camp followers, laborers, and those who died of disease are included. The total death toll, combining both sides and civilians, may have exceeded 50,000. 50,000 lives extinguished in the barren hills of Rajasthan, over the control of a single fortress. To put this in perspective, the entire population of London in 1568 was perhaps 80,000. The siege of Chittor, if our estimates are even roughly accurate, killed as many people as a medium-sized European city contained. In 4 months. In a conflict that history barely remembers outside of India. The demographic impact on the region was catastrophic. Entire villages were depopulated as men marched off to join the defense or the siege, never to return. Widows and orphans flooded into the remaining towns and cities, straining resources and charitable institutions. Agricultural production collapsed as fields were abandoned, trampled by armies, or deliberately destroyed to deny supplies to the enemy. It took a generation for the region to recover, and in some ways, it never fully did. The ethnic and clan composition of Mura shifted as new families moved in to fill the void left by those who had died. The economic center of gravity moved permanently away from Chittor toward Udaipur and other cities. But the human cost cannot be measured solely in numbers. There is also the cost in trauma, in grief, and the psychological scars borne by survivors. Consider the women who escaped the Jauhar, and there were some, spirited away through secret tunnels or hidden by sympathetic servants. They lived the rest of their lives marked by survivors' guilt, haunted by the screams of their sisters and daughters as the flames consumed them. They were honored as survivors of a sacred ritual, but also viewed with a subtle suspicion. Why did you survive when so many chose death? Were you not as brave? Were you not as pure? Consider the Mughal soldiers who participated in the post-siege massacre, who cut down unarmed civilians on orders from their commanders. Many were Muslims, raised to believe that killing the innocent was a grave sin, that warriors should show mercy to the defeated. They returned home carrying the weight of what they had done, and more than a few sought atonement through pilgrimage, charity, or renouncing military service altogether. Consider the children on both sides, who grew up in the shadow of the siege. Rajput children were told the story of Chittor as a moral lesson, a standard to which they must aspire. If your ancestors could endure such suffering for honor, how can you complain about hardship? If Jaimal could fight on a crippled leg, how can you excuse your own weakness? The siege became a cudgel with which each generation beat the next into conformity with an ideal that was glorious but also soul-crushing in its demands. And consider Akbar himself, in the years after Chittor, when he began his experiments with religious tolerance, his dialogues with Hindu and Jain philosophers, his attempts to craft a syncretic faith that would unite his diverse empire. How much of that was genuine philosophical inquiry, and how much was atonement? Was he trying to build a better empire, or trying to wash the blood of Chittor from his hands? We cannot know for certain. Akbar's inner life is lost to us, filtered through the obsequious chronicles of court historians. But it is suggestive that many of his most enlightened policies, his abolition of the jizya tax on non-Muslims, his promotion of Hindu nobles to high office, his patronage of Hindu temples and scholars, date to the years immediately following the Chittor campaign. It is as if, having demonstrated his power to destroy, he felt compelled to demonstrate his power to create, to heal, to unify. The siege of Chittor also had cultural consequences that echo through the centuries. The ballads and poems composed in its wake became foundational texts of Rajput literature, studied and memorized by generations of students. The language used in these texts, highly Sanskritized, filled with martial metaphors and religious allusions, influenced the development of Rajasthani and Hindi literature more broadly. The siege also became a popular subject for visual arts. Mughal miniature paintings often depicted the fall of Chittor, showing the massive Mughal army arrayed against the fortress, the plumes of smoke from the bombardment, the tiny figures of defenders on the ramparts. These paintings were not merely historical documentation, they were propaganda, visual assertions of Mughal power and inevitability. Rajput painters produced their own versions, emphasizing the heroism of the defenders, the nobility of the Jauhar, the treachery of Akbar's assassination of Jaimal. These competing visual narratives created parallel histories, each side telling the story in a way that reinforced its own values and identity. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Indian nationalism emerged, the siege of Chittor was adapted for new purposes. Nationalist playwrights and poets reimagined it as a story of Indian resistance to foreign oppression, eliding the complex reality that both sides considered themselves Indian and that many Rajputs fought on the Mughal side. The siege was transformed from a feudal dynastic conflict into a proto-nationalist uprising, a narrative that served contemporary political needs but distorted historical truth. The Bollywood film industry also discovered Chittor, producing multiple movies dramatizing the siege and the events surrounding it. These films, with their colorful costumes, romantic subplots, and dramatic battle scenes, reached mass audiences in a way academic history never could, shaping popular understanding and misunderstanding of what actually happened. The most famous of these films, Jodha Akbar, 2008, doesn't focus directly on Chittor but deals with the broader relationship between Akbar and the Rajputs, including his marriage to a Rajput princess. The film portrays Akbar sympathetically, as a ruler struggling to balance conquest with compassion, and it sparked controversy among Rajput groups who felt it whitewashed his brutality at Chittor and elsewhere. This ongoing contestation over the siege's meaning and legacy illustrates a fundamental truth: history is never settled, never static. Each generation reinterprets the past through the lens of its own concerns and values, finding new relevance in old stories. For modern India, the siege of Chittor raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of honor, the price of resistance, and the ethics of warfare. In an age when terrorism and counterterrorism dominate security discourse, when suicide attacks are condemned as barbaric and cowardly, how should we view the Saka, a suicidal military charge with no expectation of survival? Is it noble or nihilistic? Courageous or fanatical? And how should we view Jauhar? Is it an expression of female agency, women choosing death over dishonor? Or is it evidence of a patriarchal system so oppressive that women internalize their status as property, as vessels of male honor, to the point of self-destruction? These are not easy questions, and different people will answer them differently based on their own cultural backgrounds, political beliefs, and moral frameworks. But the fact that we still ask these questions, still debate them, still find meaning in a siege that occurred over 4.5 centuries ago, speaks to the enduring power of the story. The architectural and engineering aspects of Chittor's defenses deserve closer examination, for they reveal much about medieval Indian military thinking and the challenges faced by both attackers and defenders during the siege. Chittor was what military historians call a hill fort, a fortress built atop a natural elevation and incorporating the terrain into its defensive scheme. This was a common design in pre-gunpowder India, where the primary threats were scaling ladders, battering rams, and siege towers, all of which were far less effective against fortifications on steep slopes. The plateau on which Chittor stood rose nearly 180 meters above the surrounding plain, with cliff faces on 3 sides that were almost vertical. The only practical approach was from the eastern side, where the terrain was somewhat less steep, but even there, attackers had to ascend a winding road that switched back and forth across the hillside, passing through 7 fortified gates. Each gate was offset from the one above it, forcing any attacker to make sharp turns while under fire from defenders on the ramparts. This design created a series of natural killing zones. Soldiers attempting to force a gate would bunch up in front of it, making them easy targets for archers and musketeers on the walls above. If they managed to breach one gate, they would then have to advance upward to the next, all while exposed to flanking fire from bastions that jutted out from the walls. The walls themselves were massive, in places over 20 feet thick, built from locally quarried sandstone fitted together without mortar in the lower courses. This dry stone construction technique gave the walls a certain flexibility. They could absorb impacts without shattering, but it also made them vulnerable to mining and explosive charges, which could dislodge large sections without necessarily destroying the structural integrity of the entire wall. Within the fortress, multiple defensive lines created a defense in depth. Even if attackers breached the outer walls, they would find themselves facing additional fortifications, barricades across streets, fortified buildings that could serve as mini-fortresses, and an inner citadel that was itself a fortress within the fortress. The water supply system was particularly impressive. Chittor was home to numerous stepwells, baolis, and large artificial reservoirs, kunds, that collected rainwater and were fed by natural springs emerging from the plateau's bedrock. These cisterns were so large and so well maintained that the fortress could support a population of many thousands for months without external water supply. This was crucial during the siege. While food became scarce, water remained adequate, allowing the defenders to endure far longer than they otherwise could have. The Mughals, by contrast, had to haul water from distant sources for their massive army, a logistical challenge that consumed resources and manpower. The fortress also contained granaries, armories, temples, palaces, and entire neighborhoods of civilian housing. It was not merely a military installation but a fully functioning city that could theoretically sustain a prolonged siege indefinitely, provided food supplies could be maintained. The secret supply tunnel mentioned earlier was part of a broader network of subterranean passages. Some of these were natural cave systems, expanded and improved by human labor over centuries. Others were entirely artificial, excavated through solid rock by generations of workers. These tunnels served multiple purposes. They allowed defenders to move troops quickly from one part of the fortress to another without being observed by attackers, provided secret sally ports for surprise raids, and created an emergency escape route if the fortress became untenable. During the siege, these tunnels were invaluable. They allowed the Rajputs to conduct their devastating night raids, emerging from hidden exits far from the gates, striking at Mughal camps and artillery positions, then vanishing back into the hillside before reinforcements could arrive. The Mughals never fully mapped or controlled the tunnel system, which meant that even when they breached the outer walls, they couldn't be certain they had actually contained the defenders. However, the tunnels also had vulnerabilities. They were narrow and poorly ventilated, making them death traps if discovered and attacked. The Mughals did manage to find and block several tunnel exits during the siege, forcing the Rajputs to abandon portions of the network. And the primary supply tunnel, essential for bringing in food, became increasingly dangerous to use as Mughal patrols intensified, ultimately contributing to the famine conditions within the fortress. The Mughal siege works arrayed against Chittor were equally impressive in their own right. Akbar's engineers constructed a circumvallation, a line of fortifications surrounding the entire fortress, to prevent relief forces from breaking the siege and to keep the defenders bottled up. This circumvallation consisted of earthwork ramparts, wooden palisades, and watchtowers spaced at regular intervals, all connected by trenches that allowed Mughal troops to move under cover. Inside this outer ring, the Mughals built a second line of works, the contravallation, facing inward toward the fortress. This line contained the siege artillery emplacements, protected by earth and timber barriers designed to shield the guns from Rajput counterfire. Between these emplacements, siege trenches, zigzagging approach trenches that allowed infantry to advance closer to the walls while minimizing exposure to defender fire, snaked toward the fortress. The construction of these siege works was in itself a remarkable feat of military engineering, requiring tens of thousands of laborers working around the clock for weeks. The trenches alone represented the excavation and movement of thousands of tons of earth. The artillery emplacements had to be built on solid foundations to prevent the guns from sinking into the ground from their own recoil. All of this consumed prodigious amounts of timber, a scarce resource in the semi-arid environment of Rajasthan. Mughal foraging parties had to range dozens of miles in every direction to find trees suitable for construction, strip entire forests, and haul the logs back to the siege lines. This deforestation had long-term environmental consequences for the region, contributing to soil erosion and desertification that can still be observed today. The mining operations were perhaps the most technically demanding aspect of the siege. Mughal engineers, many of them Persians trained in techniques brought from the Ottoman Empire, supervised the excavation of multiple mines. The process was painstaking. First, a trench would be dug as close to the target wall as possible. Then, a tunnel would be excavated from the bottom of the trench, angling downward to pass beneath the wall's foundation. The tunnel had to be deep enough to avoid detection. Defenders would often place bowls of water on the ground and watch for ripples that indicated underground digging, but not so deep that the explosive charge would be too far from the target to be effective. Timber props supported the tunnel roof, and ventilation shafts, carefully concealed, provided air for the miners. When the tunnel reached beneath the wall, a large chamber would be hollowed out, and the supporting timbers would be replaced with barrels of gunpowder. A fuse, often just a trail of gunpowder, would be laid back to the tunnel entrance. When everything was ready, the fuse would be lit, and the miners would flee. If calculations were correct, the explosion would collapse the tunnel, bringing down the wall above it. If calculations were incorrect, the explosion might be too weak to damage the wall, or worse, might collapse the tunnel prematurely, killing the engineers before they could escape. Mining was one of the deadliest roles in siege warfare, with casualty rates approaching 50% on some campaigns. The psychological warfare waged by both sides during the siege of Chittor was as important as the physical combat, a battle for morale and will that ran parallel to the battle of swords and cannons. The Rajputs excelled at maintaining the defenders' spirit despite the increasingly hopeless situation. Jaimal and Pata understood that in a siege, especially one where the defenders are outnumbered, despair is as deadly as enemy artillery. They implemented several strategies to keep morale high. First, they ensured that rations, however meager, were distributed with scrupulous fairness. Officers ate the same food as common soldiers. Nobles shared the hardships of the ordinary defenders. This egalitarianism, rare in the rigidly hierarchical society of 16th-century India, created a sense of shared purpose and mutual respect. Men will endure extraordinary hardships if they believe their leaders are suffering alongside them. Second, religious rituals were emphasized. Daily prayers, recitations from sacred texts, and blessings from Brahmin priests reinforced the idea that the defenders were fighting a holy war, that their sacrifices had cosmic significance beyond the immediate military situation. The temples within Chittor remained active throughout the siege, providing psychological sanctuary and spiritual comfort to warriors who knew they were likely to die. Third, the successful night raids provided tangible proof that the defenders were not helpless, that they could still hurt the enemy. Each time Rajput warriors returned from a raid with captured Mughal weapons or reported supply depots burned, morale surged. The raids also served to remind the defenders that they were not passive victims waiting for death, but active participants in their fate, capable of striking back even from a position of weakness. The Mughals, by contrast, struggled with morale problems throughout the siege. The soldiers were far from home, camped in harsh conditions, besieging a fortress that refused to behave as fortresses were supposed to behave. In conventional siege warfare, once it becomes clear that the defenders cannot be relieved and will eventually be starved out, they typically negotiate surrender terms. But the Rajputs refused to negotiate, refused to even consider surrender, which meant the Mughals were locked into a grinding war of attrition with no clear end point. This uncertainty bred frustration and fear. Mughal soldiers never knew when a night raid might strike their section of the camp. Officers were assassinated in their tents. Supplies were burned. Sentries were found with their throats cut. The Rajputs, who had nothing to lose, were terrifyingly unpredictable. Akbar attempted to counter this with his own psychological warfare. He ordered that the heads of slain Rajput raiders be displayed on pikes outside the fortress, where defenders on the walls could see them, a brutal reminder of the cost of resistance. He also used loudspeakers, human heralds with powerful voices, to shout offers of clemency if the fortress surrendered, promising that the garrison would be allowed to depart with honor if they opened the gates. These offers were sincere. Akbar would have vastly preferred a negotiated surrender to the costly assault that eventually occurred. But they were also calculated to sow doubt among the defenders. Every time a herald called out terms of surrender, the Rajput commanders had to reaffirm their determination to fight to the death, and with each reaffirmation, a few more men began to wonder if they were dying for honor or for stubbornness. The death of Jaimal was the ultimate act of psychological warfare, though it's unclear if Akbar intended it as such or was simply taking a shot of opportunity. Regardless of intent, the impact was devastating. Jaimal had been a living symbol of indomitability, proof that courage and skill could defy even an empire. His death shattered that belief, demonstrating that even heroes are mortal, that no amount of bravery can stop a musket ball. The Rajput response, accelerating the timeline for Jauhar and Saka, was itself a psychological countermeasure. By choosing the timing of their own destruction, the defenders reclaimed agency. They would not wait for the Mughals to decide their fate, they would decide it themselves. This transformation of inevitable defeat into chosen sacrifice allowed the Rajputs to maintain the narrative of honor even in annihilation. The Jauhar, in particular, served multiple psychological functions. For the defenders, it removed the fear that haunted every besieged warrior, the fear of what would happen to their families if the fortress fell. Knowing their women and children would not be subjected to the horrors of a sack freed the men to fight without reservation, without the temptation to surrender to save loved ones. For the Mughals, the Jauhar was psychologically traumatizing. Watching thousands of people choose to burn alive rather than accept your rule is a profound rejection, a statement that death is preferable to your mercy. It delegitimized the conqueror's victory, transforming triumph into something hollow and disturbing. Many Mughal soldiers who witnessed the Jauhar from a distance, who saw the column of smoke rise from Chittor and heard the faint echoes of the women's final chants, were deeply shaken. Some refused to participate in the subsequent massacre of survivors. Others deserted, slipping away from camp at night, unable to reconcile what they were doing with their religious or moral beliefs. Akbar himself seems to have been affected. In the months following Chittor, he issued orders limiting the brutality of future sieges, instructing his commanders to offer generous surrender terms and to treat civilian populations with greater clemency. Whether this represented genuine moral growth or simply a pragmatic recognition that excessive brutality was counterproductive is debatable, but the change in policy was real. The psychological legacy of the siege extended far beyond the immediate participants. For generations afterward, Rajput warriors were raised on stories of Chittor, taught that honor mattered more than life, that to die in defense of one's principles was the highest calling. This created a warrior culture that was extraordinarily brave but also, arguably, inflexible and prone to self-destructive choices. The Mughals, meanwhile, learned a different lesson from Chittor, that military victory is not the same as political success, that a defeated enemy who becomes a martyr is more dangerous than a living enemy who can be negotiated with. Future Mughal campaigns placed greater emphasis on co-option, bribery, and diplomacy, saving military force for situations where it was truly necessary. In this sense, the siege of Chittor was a turning point not merely in the tactical history of the Mughal-Rajput conflicts, but in the strategic and psychological approach both sides took to warfare. It demonstrated the limits of pure military might and the enduring power of narratives and symbols. And it raised questions that resonate even now. What are we willing to die for? At what point does honor become stubbornness? How do we weigh the value of life against the value of principles? Different cultures, different eras, different individuals will answer these questions differently, but the siege of Chittor forces us to confront them in their starkest, most uncompromising form. The siege's climax, the Jauhar and Saka, demands a closer, more unflinching examination, for it is in these final acts that the full weight of Rajput culture and the horror of 16th-century warfare converge in a manner that is both awe-inspiring and deeply disturbing. The decision to perform Jauhar was made in the pre-dawn hours of February 23, 1568. The Rajput nobles and commanders, gathering in the inner citadel for what would be their final council, knew that with Jaimal dead and supplies exhausted, the fortress could not hold much longer. They faced a choice: surrender and beg for mercy, or end the siege on their own terms through the ancient rituals of Jauhar and Saka. For the Rajput women, Jauhar was presented as both a duty and an honor. They were told, by the priests and the noble women who had performed this ritual in earlier sieges, that to die by flame was to preserve their purity, to ensure that no Mughal soldier would ever defile them, and to secure their place in the afterlife as honored martyrs. The alternative, capture, likely sexual enslavement, bearing the children of the conquerors, was painted as a fate worse than death. How much choice did these women truly have? This is a question that modern historians grapple with, and the answer is complex and troubling. The social pressure to participate in Jauhar was immense, almost irresistible. A woman who refused, who tried to escape or hide rather than join the flames, would have been shamed, ostracized, branded a coward and a disgrace to her family. In a culture where honor was collective, where one person's actions reflected on the entire clan, the weight of expectation was crushing. Yet some sources suggest that for many women, particularly the noble women who had been raised from birth on stories of earlier Jauhars, the choice to self-immolate was genuinely embraced. They had been conditioned their entire lives to see Jauhar as glorious, as the ultimate expression of feminine virtue. To doubt this, to fear the flames, would be to doubt one's entire identity and purpose. The ritual itself was conducted in the ancient underground chambers of Chittor, vast halls that had been used for this purpose during the Jauhars of 1303 and 1535. The women dressed in their finest garments, wedding silks, festival jewelry, everything precious they possessed. Mothers dressed their children with special care, knowing these would be the last moments they spent together. Songs were sung, hymns to Parvati and Sita, idealized models of feminine devotion and purity. The pyres were built of sandalwood and other aromatic woods, soaked in ghee, clarified butter, and scented oils to ensure they would burn hot and fast, to minimize suffering. The chambers were vast enough to hold thousands, and as dawn approached, the women filed in, maintaining an eerie calm, their voices rising in chorus. When the flames were lit, they spread with terrifying speed. The heat became unbearable almost instantly. Witnesses, mostly the elderly men and boys too young to fight, who would commit ritual suicide afterward rather than face capture, reported that the women continued singing even as the flames consumed them, their voices gradually fading into silence as the smoke thickened and the inferno raged. The fires burned for hours. The heat was so intense that the stone walls of the chambers cracked, and the acrid smoke billowed up through ventilation shafts, forming a great black column visible from miles away. Mughal soldiers, watching from their siege lines, fell silent. Even the most hardened veterans, men who had seen battlefields carpeted with corpses, were awed and horrified by what they were witnessing. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was something else, something that transcended ordinary military logic and entered the realm of religion and fanaticism. It was a statement: you cannot conquer us. You can kill us, but you cannot make us submit. As the Jauhar fires raged, the Rajput warriors prepared for the Saka. They donned saffron robes, the color of martyrdom in Hindu tradition, signifying that they were already dead, already committed to sacrifice. They anointed themselves with sacred ash and recited prayers. Some wrote brief farewell notes to relatives who had escaped the siege earlier. Others simply sat in silence, meditating, preparing their minds for the final charge. There was no plan, no tactical scheme beyond charge and kill until we die. The Saka was not meant to achieve military objectives. It was meant to demonstrate that the Rajputs had chosen death over surrender, that they would deny Akbar even the satisfaction of accepting their submission. When the gates burst open and the saffron-clad warriors poured out, the Mughal soldiers initially thought it was another raid, another desperate sortie that would eventually retreat. It took several minutes for them to realize that this time, the Rajputs were not retreating, not withdrawing, not seeking to survive. They were attacking with suicidal fury, cutting through Mughal lines with no concern for their own safety, seeking only to kill as many enemies as possible before being killed in turn. The Mughal response was initially confused. Some units broke and ran, panicked by the ferocity of the assault. Others held firm, forming defensive squares, trying to contain the charge. The artillery crews, caught off guard, struggled to bring their guns to bear, eventually resorting to firing canister shot, essentially turning their cannons into giant shotguns, at point-blank range into the charging Rajputs. The Saka lasted approximately 2 hours, from the moment the gates opened until the last Rajput warrior fell. In that time, the open ground before Chittor's walls became a scene of apocalyptic slaughter. Bodies piled upon bodies. The earth turned to mud, soaked with blood. Wounded men crawled over the corpses of the fallen, seeking one more enemy to kill before their strength gave out. Pata Sisodia's final charge, his attempt to reach Akbar himself, came close to succeeding. He and his warriors carved through 2 lines of Mughal infantry, leaving hundreds dead in their wake, before elite cavalry units converged on them from multiple directions. Even then, it took concerted effort to bring Pata down. He fought until he was literally skewered on a lance, and even then, according to some accounts, he managed to kill one more Mughal soldier before his strength finally failed. When the last Rajput fell, silence descended over the battlefield. Mughal soldiers, exhausted and traumatized, picked their way through the corpses, finishing off the wounded, stripping the dead of weapons and valuables. But there was none of the usual triumphalism that followed a victory. No cheering, no celebrations. The men were too shaken, too aware of what they had just witnessed. Akbar walked the battlefield later that day, surveying the carnage. He stopped beside Pata's body, reportedly standing in silence for several minutes, staring down at the young Rajput prince whose life had ended at the point of a lance. What he thought in that moment, we cannot know. But he ordered that Pata and Jaimel be given honorable burial, rather than having their bodies desecrated as was sometimes done to defeated enemies. The aftermath was, if anything, even more horrific than the battle itself. Mughal soldiers, entering the fortress, found it essentially empty. The few civilians who had hidden rather than participate in the Jauhar were hunted down room by room, cellar by cellar. Akbar's orders regarding their fate are disputed. Some sources claim he ordered clemency, others that he ordered massacre. What is certain is that very few civilians survived. The Jauhar chambers, when they were finally cool enough to enter, revealed a charnel house of calcined bones and ash. The bodies had been so thoroughly consumed by the fire that individual remains were indistinguishable, just mounds of ash and bone fragments. Mughal soldiers tasked with clearing the chambers reportedly refused, so disturbing was the sight. Eventually, laborers had to be brought in from distant villages, men who had no connection to the siege and could approach the task dispassionately. The final chapter of the Siege of Chittor is not found in the military archives or court chronicles, but in the long aftermath, in the ways the siege shaped the centuries that followed, in the meaning that successive generations have drawn from those 4 blood-soaked months in the winter of 1567–68. For the Rajputs of Mewar, the siege became the defining event of their history, the touchstone against which all subsequent actions were measured. Maharana Pratap, who led the guerrilla resistance against the Mughals for decades after Chittor fell, invoked the siege constantly, reminding his followers that honor mattered more than comfort. That to submit to the Mughals was to betray the memory of those who had died in the flames and on the battlefield. Pratap's refusal to accept Mughal suzerainty, his decision to live in forest camps rather than palaces, to eat off leaves rather than gold plates, was explicitly framed as honoring the sacrifice of Chittor's defenders. He could not reclaim the fortress, that remained beyond his power, but he could ensure that the ideal it represented, the refusal to bow, remained alive. This created a curious dynamic in Mewar's relationship with the Mughal Empire. Even after formal peace was negotiated, even after Mewar nominally accepted Mughal suzerainty, there remained an undercurrent of defiance, a psychological resistance that never fully abated. Mewar paid tribute, yes, but grudgingly. Mewar sent representatives to the Mughal court, but insisted on protocols that emphasized their autonomy. Every interaction was a reminder: we remember Chittor, we remember what you did, and we have not forgotten or forgiven. This memory became a form of soft power, a way for a small, relatively weak kingdom to maintain dignity and a measure of independence within the larger imperial structure. The Mughals, understanding this, generally treated Mewar with more respect than its material power warranted, recognizing that pushing too hard might trigger another Chittor-like confrontation that would cost more than it was worth. For the broader Rajput community, Chittor entered the collective mythology as the ultimate exemplar of Rajput values. Ballads recounting the siege were sung at every major festival and celebration. Children were taught to recite the names of Jaimal and Pada before they could read. Marriages were celebrated with references to the Jauhar, praising brides for their purity with invocations of the women who chose flame over dishonor. This veneration had both positive and negative consequences. On the positive side, it created a strong sense of identity and pride, a cultural backbone that helped Rajput communities maintain cohesion even as the political landscape shifted around them. On the negative side, it romanticized violence and martyrdom, created rigid gender norms that limited women's autonomy, and fostered a culture of honor that sometimes valued symbolic gestures over practical outcomes. The practice of Jauhar itself, thankfully, became increasingly rare after Chittor. Partly this was due to changing military realities. Sieges became less common as warfare evolved, but partly it was due to changing social attitudes. Even in the 16th and 17th centuries, there were voices questioning whether mass self-immolation truly served any purpose, whether it might not be wiser to survive and resist in other ways. These voices grew louder over time, and by the 18th century, Jauhar had largely disappeared as an actual practice, though it remained powerful as a symbolic reference point. For the Mughal Empire, Chittor was both a validation and a warning. It validated Akbar's military strategy, proving that no fortress could withstand sustained artillery bombardment and determined siege operations. This emboldened further campaigns of conquest, leading to the Mughal absorption of much of the Indian subcontinent over the following decades. But it also warned of the limits of military power. The cost of Chittor, in lives, resources, and moral legitimacy, was so high that it shaped Akbar's approach to governance thereafter. He became more willing to accommodate Hindu sensibilities, more interested in synthesis and integration than in forced conversion or cultural domination. His famous policy of Sulaikul, universal peace, which granted religious freedom to all communities within the empire, owed much to the lesson of Chittor, that force alone cannot create lasting stability, that empires built solely on conquest will always face resistance. The statues of Jaimal and Pata at Agra Fort, erected on Akbar's orders, were extraordinary gestures of respect to fallen enemies. By honoring them, Akbar was attempting to co-opt their narrative, to transform them from martyrs of resistance into honored warriors whom even the emperor admired. It was propaganda, certainly, but it was also recognition of a fundamental truth, that symbols and stories matter as much as armies and fortresses. In the broader sweep of Indian history, the siege of Chittor marked a transition point. It was one of the last great fortress sieges conducted in the traditional manner, before warfare evolved into more mobile campaigns featuring field armies and artillery trains. The age of the impregnable hill fort was ending, not because defenders lacked courage, but because the technology of destruction had advanced to the point where no fortress, however formidable, could hold indefinitely. This technological shift had profound implications. Fortresses had been the foundation of regional power in medieval India, allowing relatively small kingdoms to resist larger empires by retreating behind walls and enduring sieges. Once fortresses became vulnerable, the balance of power shifted permanently toward entities that could field large, well-equipped armies, which inevitably meant toward larger states and empires at the expense of smaller kingdoms. Chittor's fall, in this sense, foreshadowed the consolidation of power that would characterize the following centuries, culminating in British colonial rule. The same gunpowder technology that allowed the Mughals to reduce Chittor would eventually give the British the means to subdue the Mughals themselves. But the memory of Chittor endured, outlasting empires. When India achieved independence in 1947, the fortress became a national monument, a tourist destination, and a subject of renewed historical interest. Scholars excavated the ruins, documented the architecture, compiled oral histories from descendants of the siege's survivors. The fortress was restored, not to military functionality, but as a memorial, a place where Indians could connect with their past. Today, visitors to Chittor walk paths where Jaimal once patrolled, stand on ramparts where Pata made his last stand, descend into the chambers where the Jauhar fires burned. They read plaques explaining the history, take photographs of the Tower of Victory silhouetted against the sky, and then return to their air-conditioned tour buses, back to a world where sieges and Jauhars exist only in history books and museums. The fortress stands empty, as it has for centuries, a monument to a way of life that no longer exists, to values that feel simultaneously noble and alien. It asks questions of every visitor: what would you die for? What principles are worth the ultimate sacrifice? How do we honor the past without being imprisoned by it? These are not easy questions. Different people will answer them differently. But the mere fact that Chittor continues to provoke such questions, that it remains relevant and meaningful more than 4.5 centuries after the last fires died, speaks to something profound about human nature and the power of narrative. We are a species that tells stories to make sense of our world, to define who we are and what we value. The Siege of Chittor is one such story, a narrative of courage and tragedy, of honor and horror, of a small group of people who chose death over submission and in doing so ensured that their choice would echo through the centuries. Whether that choice was wise, whether it served any practical purpose, whether the sacrifice was worth the cost, these are questions each generation must answer for itself. But the story endures, and in its endurance, there is a kind of victory. Not the victory of arms, not the victory of conquest, but the victory of memory over oblivion, of meaning over meaninglessness. Chittor stands. The people who defended it are dust. The empire that conquered it is dust. But the story lives on, passed from generation to generation, told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, forever a part of the vast tapestry of human experience. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all any of us can hope for, that when we are gone, the choices we made, the values we stood for, will be remembered and will mean something to those who come after. The defenders of Chittor achieved that, at least. They are remembered. Their sacrifice has meaning, even if that meaning is contested, even if different people draw different lessons from it. The siege that broke an empire. Or perhaps, the siege that proves some things cannot be broken, no matter how overwhelming the force arrayed against them. Honor. Pride. The human capacity to choose death over dishonor, to make a final stand even when all hope is lost. These are the legacies of Chitter. These are the echoes that still resound across the centuries, whispering from the empty ramparts, from the silent chambers, from the blood-soaked ground where 8,000 held against 200,000, and in holding, won a victory that transcended military defeat. The story is told. The names are remembered. Jaimel and Pata, who fought until they could fight no more. The thousands who chose flame over dishonor. The kingdom that refused to bow. And standing witness to it all, through centuries and empires, through the rise and fall of dynasties, through colonization and independence, and the modern age, Chitter. The Hill of Kings. The fortress that would not be conquered, even in conquest. The monument to the price of defiance, and the power of memory.